Okay, so I think we're ready to go. Welcome everybody. We're going to be talking about FHIR for medication definition. So this is pharma industry, regulatory, an extra level of medication information that you might not see in your normal prescribing workflow. So that's me. You don't need to see that. Right, so the root of this information is this ISO standard called IDMP, Identification of Medicinal Products. So that's its title, Data Elements and Structures for a Unique Identification. So it kind of majors on identification of products, but really the key to identification of products is to be able to know what they consist of. So they're uniquely identified, but really the identifier is a product of what's in the thing, its ingredients, its strength, formulation, and so on. So although the headline is identification, and that's the kind of a driving use case, what is this blue pill? Is it the same as this yellow pill that I got prescribed somewhere else? You know, can I replace this with this, and so on. But really the key to identification is the full sort of description of what's in the thing and where it came from. So the model and the classes we're talking about today are less about identification, more about the full description of the thing. So an ISO standard, it took about best part of 10 years or something, and it was finished a couple of years ago. It's due to be refreshed in in 5 years from then, so in 3 years from now or so on. So it's a big, long, boring ISO document, and it has those numbers. So that's a bit. That's not going to work. Okay, so what's in this stuff? What's in this IDMP? So it's a logical model, a class model of medicines, medications, products, whatever you want to call them. They tend to be called products because these are medicines in the kind of the context of being manufactured and sold. So it's a product rather than just aspirin in the abstract. It's something that's manufactured and has laws that apply to it. It's regulated. You know, medicines are regulated in every jurisdiction you can think of. You're not allowed to sell drugs unless they've been through clinical trials and some legal entity has said, yep, safe to use this drug. So it's a regulatory thing, and the amount of detail you need is more than you normally get when you're prescribing. When you're prescribing, typically you need to say, well, I'm going to take this aspirin, acetaminophen, paracetamol, whatever. You might say it's tablets. You might not. It might not matter. You don't normally say what manufacturer it is because it doesn't really matter. Except in a few cases, it doesn't matter much. And then you probably say, well, take it twice a day before meals, and this 200 milligrams or whatever. But beyond that, anything that fulfills that is good. You probably don't care about what package it comes in, what manufacturer it is, what ingredients it was made out of, because that's kind of implied. So you'd have some sort of code for that medication. It could be an RX norm code, a Dutch, is it the G standard that you guys use over here? But it's just a really thin code that represents that drug, and then you can go and look up in the G standard or in SNOMED what that drug corresponds to. But it might not have much more than the name and the full name and the code. This is the kind of the level below that describes what that kind of drug really means. If you looked it up in your pharmacopoeia or whatever it is, the full information of that medicine is what you have in here. And the link between the prescribing, dispensing world and this world is often just a code. So there might not be an actual, physical database link. You have to, look it up in one system and find it in the other. But with FHIR now, you can, in theory, have that information in the same system. It may not be in the same system, but you can use FHIR resources to have it closely coupled if you want to. So the ISO stuff, it's a logical model. It's a class model, UML model, and it doesn't have a physical expression. It's not implementable. There's no XML, and there's certainly no FHIR. So that's how we get to today's task. This is the kind of high-level view. The next slide shows it kind of zoomed in, but it's medicinal product, the thing itself. It includes things like indications, clinical particulars we call them, so what you take it for, what you're not supposed to take it for, what it interacts with, and so on. Detailed naming. Drugs often have different names in different territories, and includes things like which part of the name of the drug is the dose, or which part is the strength, or the slow release, fast release, and which is the kind of proprietary names, so the Panadol for paracetamol, this kind of thing. Manufacturing, where it comes from, who owns this drug, that's important because that's what it's all about. Marketing authorization. Marketing doesn't mean selling so much as the ability, it's not about promoting it and advertising it, it's about whether you're allowed to have it on the market. And there's lots of, it'll link to the legislation that was in place that this has been, proved to have passed and so on. And we have some more sort of physical details, like what package it comes in. Does it come in a vial, in a blister pack? Is it packaged with something else? Is it blue? Is it whatever? And then we have an interesting concept, pharmaceutical product, which is kind of hard to distinguish between these two things. But the pharmaceutical, sometimes called administrable product, is how the drug is physically given to the patient. Now, it might be different from how it comes in the box. So you may grind it up, you may mix two things together. So normally you just have the tablet, you take the tablet. But this is necessary for times when you combine the tablet with a solvent, and that might have different chemical properties. It might not last very long, and you wouldn't buy the combined thing or or find it on the shelf. You'd mix it together. So ingredients are of both the combined thing and the kind of uncombined thing. So that's the kind of 20,000 foot view. Now, you won't be able to read that, but that's giving you an idea of the size of IDMP. So there's, for products, you've got whatever that is, about 50 classes and a couple of hundred, maybe more than that, maybe, 300 elements. So quite big. And that's, big when you compare it to most FHIR models. It's kind of too big for one page, as you can see. IDMP actually has two parallel models, one for authorized, things that are already on the market, or could be, and then investigational. So there's actually two models, but they overlap by about 90% really. So in FHIR we've collapsed those two. There's not much difference between them. There's also a whole substance model. This is the product model, IDMP, but there's the world of substances, which kind of breaks off when we get down to ingredient down here. That goes into another equally complicated model of substances. So you've got all sorts of details about the molecular structure of the thing and what process was used to make the ingredient. If it's a polymer, you have the chain of the polymer, down to all sorts of very scientific stuff indeed. So if you thought that was complicated, the substance world is even bigger. So just zooming into the midsection there, these are the kind of things we've got. The product itself, its combined form, which represents all the package will say like tablet and solution or something like this, or like powder and solution for injection. So this might represent multiple things. Naming, structured naming, classifications and so on, and some sort of things that are quite specific to IDMP. Has some things that are really not about the product but almost about the record. It's got documents that are attached, and a header. This is more about submitting the thing. So these don't really fit that well. IDMP's, it kind of wants to be message oriented and has some kind of, this is really kind of messaging around you publishing this version of the product. So it's a bit of a mishmash of different things. So when we map that onto FHIR, we don't kind of bring that in because FHIR has its own messaging, for instance. So if that'll work. So what kind of things, why do we have all that stuff? There's a lot of stuff in there. It's not obvious what it's all for. The medicinal product at the top, in a way, is almost just like a header. There's not that much in there. It's kind of like you've got to have something at the top that ties all the rest of it together. So there's not much in the product other than that combined dose form you've seen and some IDs. But you can have products that come in different packages, and they're typically regulated as one thing. So when you go to EMA or the FDA and you say, can I put this drug on the market? You do it once. You don't do it once for the 20 pack and once for the 50 pack. So logically, they get one license. So those are grouped together. Makes sense. But each pack might have multiple things within it. So you might get the powder and the solution in a slightly more complicated case than is common, but it does happen. So another level of physical, and then you've got this concept, as we saw, of they get mixed together just before the patient takes it, and so this has different properties, and then it's taken by the patient. So this is the only thing that the patient physically takes. The patient might, they might be given one of these with that in it, but they would not in a way, they're kind of logically given one of these, but they'd physically be given one of the two pack options. So we've got our kind of regulatory header stuff, we've got our physical level, and then we've got the kind of chemical, what's actually taken level. So that's part of the reason for all the complexity. But also there's just a whole load of stuff. So you might get a device in the package as well. This is one package. There's two on the previous one, but just taking one of them, it might have both a blister pack of tablets and a tube. You sometimes get the same, or sort of two different, completely different products really in one package, because it's like, take one and then take the next one every day for a week or so. So a cream and a tablet. So packaging, the physical. This manufactured item is the actual physical final thing. It's the tablet that you'd get in some packaging, maybe in some further packaging. And then those are two chemical things. You might take, you're not mixing them, but you're taking one day and one the next, and that goes to the patient. So you're adding on things like extra things that come in the package. And you might get more detailed and say, well, some people are allergic to latex or whatever, or there might be some manufacturing issue. Is this made of metal or is it plastic, and how big is it, and so on. And you might say, well, okay, this device is made of plastic, and well, what color and what size is the plastic component. So these are the kind of things that prescribers and probably patients don't care about, but the supply chain might need to know, and all the rest of it. And then you can say, well, the whole thing is manufactured by this manufacturer, but they buy in the plastic top from a factory in India. So if there's some defects in it, you might want to know that. So you've got these kind of logical levels going down, but then you've got the more levels of detail kind of going out sideways. So messaging. So as I say, it's not a message. It's a big logical model, but we need to communicate this around the place. And so the reason I got into this is a couple of years ago, the EMA, who are just now down the road, the European Medicines Agency, who are in Amsterdam now, they have an existing system that tracks the new drugs that come out. That when manufacturers try and get things on the market, they send to EMA. And they've been doing that for a long time. They have a proprietary XML format. FDA in the US, they do similar things, and I'm sure in Japan and other places they have similar things. They wanted to re-implement their system, carrying all this information, but there was nothing in FHIR for it. And so we tried to fit it into FHIR and see how it goes. And the next few slides are about how that worked, and well, it's been a bit challenging. So there is the FHIR medication resource, and there's medication request, administration, and so on. And there's also a substance resource. But these two in particular are pretty lightweight and small. There's a lot in administration because you can, there's all sorts of people involved, and there's structured dosing and dates and times and things, and repeats, quite complicated. But medication is really, it's kind of just a code, as I was saying, and you only really fill out most of medication in terms of its volume if you're prescribing something that's mixed up. It's like go to the pharmacy and get a tablet dissolved in something. So these are unusual edge cases. And substance is very small indeed. It's again, it's pretty small. You don't need that much for prescribing. So we looked at those, and they're the right kind of concepts. I mean, this medicinal product, it is a medication kind of, but it's just not got enough stuff. And we didn't want to like bulk up, fill the medication resource and all prescribing with a huge load of stuff that's only really used in a different industry. So that was kind of the challenge. Well, this next slide, if it'll do it, yeah, speaks to that. So IDMP is big. You've seen that high-level diagram. It's kind of too big for one screen. 50-odd classes. Substance is probably 3 or 4 times the size. Really loads of stuff. And the idea is to combine that with FHIR in a way that doesn't kind of break prescribing. And when we came to FHIR with this and said to pharmacy, this is all the stuff that we need, they're like, well, none of our guys, we don't care about this. Prescribers and doctors and patients, they don't care about this, and they don't really see the parallel world of regulatory manufacturing. It's like a different universe that isn't direct clinical care, so most people kind of don't care about it, but it's a real important thing. It's just kind of behind the scenes for most clinicians. So there was an interesting kind of education challenge, and this is real stuff. We do need this, so that's been fun. But yeah, products, this is what we're talking about for, you go to the doctors, you get a prescription, medication resource, the kind of workflow classes around it that say when you take it and so on and substance. But the supply chain and the legal regulate and clinical trial world needs a lot more stuff, packaging and so on, indications, contraindications. But some of the things that they deal with that they discover during clinical trials are actually kind of relevant for day-to-day prescribing. You know, there are knowledge bases that say don't give aspirin and warfarin, or don't, you know, because or ibuprofen has got is the same class of drugs. So there are it's a kind of another kind of crossover world about prescribing support and knowledge bases. And that there's no FHIR resources for those kind of like, you know, how do I know if this drug A interacts with drug B? So we've got a kind of detailed regulatory level, but these pieces, and some of these pieces, we actually reuse for this other kind of hybrid use case. So how does it all fit together? Well, this is the kind of existing world of a prescription, and the prescription refers to medication. As I mentioned, that's quite a sort of small thing, usually pretty small, often really essentially just a code. You can imagine it just literally being in there as a code. You might get a device. I mean, perhaps in more in secondary care in a hospital, you might get some device prescribed, like a leg implant or like a knee implant or something. And then you may occasionally, even less commonly, that you get the detailed description of what the medication is made of. But typically that's implicit in the code, and you go off to RX norm or whatever and look up what it is, DM&D in the UK, whatever. But all those are there, and they're part of the day-to-day workflow. So that's the clinical uses. That exists. Is that going to do it? Yeah. So this is the stuff that we want to bring in. We've got this. This is the IDMP. You've seen that. It's big. And this is the current medication resource as it stands. So 3 boxes, batch number. Okay, use case for that. Ingredients. Normally you don't bother with ingredients. So really you're talking about 2 or 3, maybe 5 data elements in here versus this guy. So we could have just gone. Oh, in fact, we've considered just taking all that, lumping it in there, and but that was kind of shaking things up. And the thing about FHIR is it's meant to be, you look at it, makes sense, you do it, and you can use medication. You can walk up to that, see what it does, implement it. When we're faced with all this kind of stuff, 90% of which clinicians don't care about, it starts to go away from this ethos of making FHIR simple and so on. So how do we fix that? And is that going to do it? Yeah. It's even worse for substance because, well, substance is of the same order of size as medication. But this is just one of the bits of substance, and it's very interlinked, and there's about probably 10 or so diagrams like that for substance. It's even more complicated, and even less, the substance guys, they're locked away in their academic worlds, and it's all very important, but that's even further away from clinical practice. So we didn't really want to bulk up this massively and bulk up this massively. So what do we do? How do we square that circle? Is it going to do it? Yeah. So we decided to have a kind of another strata, if you like. And the difference between this guy, the medicinal product definition, and medication is in a kind of described by relationship, which is a bit of a weird concept, and I'm not entirely happy with it. But if you do an ISA relationship, then you end up just bulking up this guy or using inheritance in FHIR, which it doesn't have. So we had to kind of model this in some pragmatic way. So then we decided to have a kind of a whole regulatory extra layer here. So we have product definition, device definition, substance definition. So we're kind of reinventing that kind of mirror world, upside down kind of world, stranger world. And then, that didn't appear. Yeah, sure.
Question right here.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Which one is an instance? So I thought medication, especially device, is an instance of a device.
Yeah.
A specific instance.
It is. Yeah.
So.
Well, there's a funny thing because medication here, this unlike the old HL7 version 3 world, it's a bit of a combination of instance or kind. So FHIR tries to get away from this, a whole load of classes for instance and a whole load of class codes for, or mood codes for kind. So medication is actually somewhat, it's something of an instance, something of a kind. So it's already a bit of a hybrid. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a fudge, but it's kind of a fudge, but it works. In a given use case, you can say we're using this and we're only using it for instances, or you might have a formulary and we're using this, but we're only using it for kinds. But you're right, there is a bit of and that's part of the problem. Yeah, Jose.
We have product discussions where these things are becoming very visible.
Yeah.
On device, you have this separation. On medication, you have this hybrid model. So we are pushing out a pattern to say this is what product definition should be like, and then we'll see how much what but it's a common.
It's an issue, that thread runs through the whole of this. So device is meant to, I'm not sure if we knew it was instance versus kind originally, but now there's a parallel resource for definition. That's just been approved, in fact. So there's more of a split. But they are, in fact, pretty similar. So whether it's necessary to have two or whether you could have had a flag for instance versus kind. But this, as well as being certainly more definitional than this, is also a lot bigger. So they differ in this kind of fairly abstract thing of size. But the device one is pretty similar. They're almost the same. And then there's even more details. Substance specification resource. These are all resources proposed or existing. Most of them exist now. Then there's all sorts of details of polymers and nucleic acids and amino acids and things that are probably going to go in another rack of resources. And then we have our, that'll do it. It won't do. Over on the left there, there you go. You've got the authorization concept. So IDMP tracks, as I say, when it was submitted to the regulators. Did it pass first time? Was it rejected? Has it been banned from use because it's got something wrong with it? So those things which only really exist in the regulatory world are also there. And our use issues is the resource that covers things like indications, contraindications, and so on. So then we have there's a medication knowledge resource, which is designed to kind of pull together the parts of this that are needed for knowledge bases and for day-to-day prescribing support. So decision support in ordinary clinical practice has its own resource. I mean, it could, in theory, be a collection of the others, but it has its own resource, and it points to some of these other resources. So there's a bit of our third world, sort of domain is in that resource. But all these pieces are common. So that's the world we came up with, and this is a big chunk of stuff. There's lots of resources. It's pretty complicated, but it is nevertheless a key thing that certain industries do use. Yeah. Do you want to go back? Yeah.
So if in one country, if we have the medicinal product is defined not in the ISO EMP concept, so it's not really an administrable product, it's not really a pharmaceutical product, it's something in between, it's a hybrid mix of that. How would you do that? Which resources would you use the medicinal product definition and a bit of each of the others to populate as you need? So something like paracetamol, boxes of 20. This is not really any brand, but boxes of 20. This is not really an IDMP concept, but it's a legal concept in some countries. How would you...
Well, good question. I mean, you could just put that in there, and in some domains you would go down to the package definition and so on, but you don't have to use all of these. There's nothing. This is a kind of header for the whole thing, and there's you could collapse some of them in there. You could, in theory, if you didn't want all this thing, but you wanted one of the items from here, you could perhaps put an extension on here, and so there's still a range of ways you can use this, and we're not saying everybody will need all of these, but and there's some guidance and profiling to be done to make them applicable.
So this is an international model?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is needed? So I guess you can't answer, but you spoke specifically of the EMA.
Yeah.
So is there a part of this that's going to be specialized or extended with European requirements?
Yeah, so we're using some of this now in Europe. So we're implementing these resources in EMA now, but we're not using every last bit. We are using most of it because the requirements. We're implementing IDMP. I mean, and so IDMP was a worldwide thing, and it's an ISO thing. So FDA and the Japanese agency, I can't remember the name, and the Europeans were very much involved in the next generation requirements that they all shared. And then, so EMA are implementing most of that, 90% of that, and some extensions that we never thought of at the time. They've moved into the vet world, for instance, as well. So there's non-human medicine in there. So EMA are now implementing most of this. And most of this is already around in SPL So in the US, the FDA SPL standard has all of this in a version 3 message. Go on then. Yep.
Is there a way to explain the difference between medication knowledge and medicinal product definition without being IDMP expert?
It's more about the use. This is. I mean, they do overlap, but it's kind of like the use case. This is kind of the information you'd need to support using it. You know, can I use it for this? What's its price? This includes things like pricing, which doesn't really have an analogy. So in the regulatory world, and a few other things like the pharmacokinetics, which are needed in these things, but are not in there. So it's kind of like you use the information is kind of similar, but in fact it doesn't overlap too much because we reuse the same resources. If you look at this, it's a kind of a different. It's almost like a different header, knowledge versus regulatory. That's really all I can say about it. It's not easy to describe it in one thing. Right, I'll move on. So this is just to say what we have and where things are in IDMP as they are now. And these are beyond, well, there's a cut of them in R4, FHIR R4, but some of the names have changed and they've definitely been filled out. And so the real version is the R5 version, which you'll see in the build.phir.org world, the kind of, the continuous build. So those are the old names, these are the new names, and those are the IDMP concepts. So they're almost the same, but we've, medicinal products, made sure it's definitional. A few things have changed, regulated, or some are the same, some are different. Pharmaceuticals become administrable because that's how people typically understand that concept. And these four, what the drug does in combination with other things, have been collapsed down into one resource. So it's all draft, but yeah, you can find it if you go to resource types. If you want to look at these, it's got its own little, you go to the resource page down the bottom here, it's got its own little medication definition thing, so you can find them grouped together. It's a little bit out of date because most of these are now up to 1, so they're all approved with a couple of exceptions. They're all real FHIR things and no longer just completely draft, so they do exist. Yeah, just the status. They've all been approved. When I did this slide originally, it was on and off, but they're all approved now, with the exception of that one, which is we've been told to go back and get some more information. And then substance. So substance. This is the main one that has most of the information. Substance definition, but then for even more detailed use cases, we're planning. And there's a little bit on hold, but for the kind of the more detailed and polymers, nucleic acid wheels, there's some more content to come. So how is it different? The scope is the same. We cover all the authorised and investigational medicines in IDMP. We've added a few specials for vet use. EMA have this veterinary use case that wasn't considered in IDMP. So that we may try and feed those back into IDMP later, or we'll see. IDMP is a logical model, and it has its naming is a bit of a boast and so on. So FHIR has done a few kind of normalizations and things. IDMP includes things like organizations, so we don't need to have that in FHIR. We just reference those things. So in general, it's kind of a clone, but we've simplified it significantly. If you've seen IDMP, the resources should look pretty familiar. So that's what our core resource looks like. So medicinal products with the naming, which is on the top left, if you remember earlier. We added a few things. The contact is new, that didn't exist. Special designation, which is about orphan drug use and if it's licensed for certain rare diseases and so on. Manufacturing, etc. And that is the FHIR implementation of that. So we've got rid of things like header, which are very kind of message oriented. Renamed a few things, orphan designation, special designation, classification has been collapsed. It's just a code, so that's been collapsed into the body somewhere there, and so on. So cross-reference has stayed, the name is the same. So broadly the same if you know IDMP. That's what it looks like on the wire, just standard FHIR. Some of the examples have maps to where it comes from in the ISO model, but it's all good FHIR. But if you haven't seen FHIR before, or if you're a pharma guy and haven't seen FHIR before, that's what FHIR looks like. It's relatively easy to read with the element names are sensible. authorizations of things. Really, an authorization is just somebody saying that, according to some rule on a certain date, this drug can be used or approved for a certain thing. We have that, a little bit more of a tour into packaging. So packaging is packages with things inside them, and packages can contain packages, and they have numbers on them, and the things they contain are either devices or tablets and so on, and tablets have who manufactures them and ingredients, and whether it's a pill or a powder or whatever. So that's down to the physical level. The last one of those. So this is our administrable thing. This is the only thing that the patient ever actually physically gets, as in their body. And it has this is the place where you see the route, and some of the dosage things are in here, and so on. Yeah, right. So the other remaining two actually. So we've got our indications and contraindications interactions. They've been brought into one resource. That was a bit. We went backwards and forwards on that a little bit, but we've settled on combining them into one thing for now. So that's as it is. And then the bottom level in terms of detail linking into the substance world is our ingredient resource. And that goes into details of strength measured in different ways, and which substance, and whether it's strength of itself or strength compared to some other chemical. Sometimes you get this strength and the strength of the chloride or the salt and so on. All detailed chemical stuff. And that looks almost identical to the IDMP shape if you've seen it. So they're all draft. They're all approved apart from one, and apart from some of the substance ones. And we've concentrated more on the products so far than the substances, just because of it's just the use cases that have first come along. But we're starting to look at the more detailed substances next. So the FDA are using the substance in their PQ CMC system, which is a manufacturing quality tracking, are things contaminated and so on, tracking that sort of thing. So they're going to need a bit more detail here probably. It's all fairly new in draft, so if you like the look of this, or you think, well, I could use that, but it doesn't fit my use case quite, then you're welcome to comments and so on. But we're EMA on the project I'm on are developing with these kind of right now. It's not live yet, but they're cutting code at the moment, finding issues that we're feeding back and so on. We've filled in the mappings for some of the things, so you can find how this fits to ISO, and you can see some of the gaps and things we've added in that weren't in ISO and so on. So this is perhaps our sort of change request list for the next version of ISO. We added in domain, because domain is human or non-human, so that wasn't in ISO. And a few pragmatic things like a text description. IDMP is structured, and it doesn't allow for systems to put free text in, but in the real world, systems are not fully structured, and you need some text. We have an indication at the top level because it's not zapping it, but you can see the indication there. Yeah, we have a structured indication in IDMP, but in practice, people tend to have text, and it will be multiple indications in one. It will say, well, given for the following conditions in a list, so it's not easy to break that down. So pragmatically, we've got a top-level indication and so on. So these things you discover in implementation. Before we close, that's what substance looks like. The part of substance has been implemented, and we zoom in next, so you can see substance definition includes things like the structure, molecular weight, isotopes, all these kind of things, which is it mole file or whatever type of chemical structure. Names get very complicated, and moieties and active elements and so on. So that's really only about 10 or 20% of the ISO substance world, but it's the most useful and the most commonly used. So EMA are implementing that now, and there's extension points here for if it's a polymer. Again, we are probably going to use another resource to kind of bolt on extra information. So that's a bit of a weird modelling thing, another sort of sideways resource. But the alternative is to kind of, if this is a polymer, then there should be a load of polymer stuff on the side, really, in this diagram. But for practical reasons, it's broken out. So the EMA have this SPOR project, substances, products, organisations, and referentials, what they call codes, value sets, and so on. And the substance and product ones are being done right now using the resources you've just seen. The earlier two were already delivered before FHIR was doing this, so that they're non-FHIR, just because of timing. And yeah, some of these use cases, pharmacovigilance, so when drugs go wrong and so on, clinical trials, etc. And so we're using 5 products and substances, and organisation was done already. And yeah, I mentioned the FDA are currently doing this project, and our Norwegian, European folks are planning to use some of this as well. So this, this will be implemented sort of Europe-wide, so that all European drug manufacturers, or EU at least anyway, are required to submit this information to EMA. So although it's a kind of a small thing now, it's going to reach out across the whole manufacturing industry across Europe. So it is kind of big in scope. So it's quite a big deal for the pharma industry in general. And that's my last slide. So any more questions? Mark?
Yeah, this is great. So I don't know if you're going to, whether the scope of this is eventually going to go to drug submissions, new drug
definitely,
applications.
absolutely in scope. Yeah.
In which case, of course, it becomes adverse event reports, clinical trial modeling. The litany is long, and it would certainly include the submission of evidence, which currently is in CDISC and STDM and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, and of course, with adverse event, there's been some attempts to model that in FHIR, but I thought not in the way that the FDA wants. Not using MEDRA and.
Well, the different people who use adverse events, they're very keen on doing it their way, and so there's some of that to be got through. And the question is whether the adverse event resource is just the event, or whether it's the whole report. People say, but an adverse event is this document. And you say, well, it's not that document, is it? That's because that's the report. So
have you looked for
you're right.
Listing all these things
they're all in scope of things. And the BR&R work group, Hughes co-chair, and the patient care for adverse events, they're all those things are kind of in scope. And having the trial, the data as observations rather than CDISC maybe in FHIR, and having the clinical trial research subjects. There's the resources emerging for all of these things, and the submission would be a dossier. Now it's like a structured document, but it'd be nice to make that a FHIR document, or a bunch of FHIR observations, clinical trial participants. You'd wrap it all up, send it along with your ingredients and all the rest of it, and you get a whole bunch of FHIR. That would be all that stuff is in scope. But it's early days. This is relatively easy to kind of differentiate, because it's they physically transmit this stuff now, and it's already structured. The drug companies already have this in structure in theory, whereas the trial stuff is more the mishmash of formats and text and so on, PDFs and So any more? I think we're more or less at time. I'm going, Arden, hi. Yeah, so there's any way you like, but the EMA are using a RESTful interface, and it's complicated by the fact there are lots of resources. So we're probably talking about transactions, bundles of this link to this. You'd send a whole, and whether we allow updating just this bit or just that bit is still kind of being worked through. So there's a lot of implementation guidance to go. Yeah, one question at the back then is probably lunchtime.
So do you have an actual timeline? When is it when is it to be required and so on?
So I don't know about the legal aspects and when it's going to be rolled out and so on, but there's supposed to be code and demo code, and you'd be able to use the servers sort of early next year for EMA, I believe. I'm not the project guy or anything, but so it's not going to be mandated before the end of 2020 or something, or at least. But it's coming. So within the next couple of years, people will be doing this around the UK, around Europe, and everywhere. Go on, one last one, and then I think we're probably done. As how mature? Yeah, well, they're pretty mature now. We've been through a couple of rounds of renaming and approval and change requests, so they're getting there. 2/3 or 3/4 of the way to go, done, and R5 is still a long way off. One of the problems actually is that most people don't need what's in R5, but all of our stuff is in R5. We don't really want to wait till 2021 for R5, so we're hoping that the tools will catch up, and we don't want to wait for R5 really. Well, we want everybody. We want we want all the libraries because people are using Java, they're using C#. We want all the tools to do R5 for this stuff. Yeah, now, yeah, the sooner the better. Yeah, yeah. So we've been waiting.
Probably just 4.1.
Just 4.1.
4.1.
Yeah, well,
Because it's an addition.
could be.
It's
Yeah,
not- you
I'd be.
don't rely on something
Yeah.
that's in-
No, it's just new content. Yeah, it doesn't change anything. All right, so I think we declare lunch. I think. Thanks, guys.